We begin this course about population history with a small introduction on the concept itself of population history. And in general, in this course, we will analyze three main aspects of population history in order to understand how world population evolves and changes over time, because of course we have an historical perspective. However, population history, even though it's an history, it is also a very interdisciplinary field of study. So we will try to put together two different perspectives. The first perspective is the social sciences perspective. And to understand this perspective, we will follow the works and studies of an Italian scholar and demographer, Massimo Livi-Bacci. Instead, the other perspective is rather different because it is the perspective of the genetics and of biology, and in this case we will refer to the works and the studies of this Italian scholar, Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza. And since Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza is a very, very important figure, I would like just to introduce you to him. As you can see, he is no longer living, but this is Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza as a very young student of medicine. In fact, he was a scientist, he was a medicine doctor. He got his degree from the University of Pavia, but while at the University of Pavia, he also attended that building, and that building is the Collegio Ghislieri. The Collegio Ghislieri is a university college for students. It's a college based on merit. So there, our scientist was able to be in contact every day with students of very, very different fields. So since the beginning of his career as a student and as a scholar, he was very open-minded, and he felt the need and the necessity to refer not only to medicine and science and biology, but also to use a different perspective, a more social science perspective. So when he became a famous and important scholar abroad, in Cambridge and then Stanford University, he used medicine in order to understand history and the other way around. And he did a series of studies on genetics, on genetic differences between human races, just to finally establish in a very important, strong scientific way that there are no significant genetic differences between human races. And to affirm this rather important sentence, he used also a series of archaeological and historical data, and especially also linguistic data. In fact, the work we will explore mainly is a work of 1996 called Genes, Peoples and Languages. So he was able to put together all these biological, cultural and linguistic data to assess that there are no significant genetic differences between human races. And so we can study population as a whole, as something really global. And the other topic, the final part of the course, will be devoted to explore a single case, a single factor, which is very important and which has a great impact over population, and I'm talking about epidemics and diseases. Epidemics and diseases is rather an interesting topic because, once again, it's an interdisciplinary topic, because it's not only about the history of medicine, but it also is about cultural and political measures took to control epidemics. And of course, when we have policies about health, public health, we also have a series of debates. And these debates are not only scientific ones, as we can witness also nowadays, but they are also moral and political debates. So, especially using a single case, the case of the smallpox, we will explore this topic of epidemic, its impact over population, and all the other cultural, political, moral, and so on implications. And smallpox is a disease which no longer exists. It has been eradicated, but for a long period, since the beginning of the early modern age and until the second half of the 20th century, it was a rather infective and dangerous disease. And in fact, smallpox also was instrumental in the conquest of Latin America by Europeans, as we will see more in detail. So the contents of the course will be this one. The historical perspective on population, the biology perspective, and then a single case, epidemics, a single factor which has a very important impact over population. Many scholars who are interested in population history are interested in such kind of questions. They study population history in order to understand why are we 7 billion and not 1 billion or 10 billion or so on. For many historians who study population history, the main goal is not only to describe how population is, how many people are there in the world, but the main goal is to understand why there are a certain number of people and not another. The main idea is to understand the mechanisms of increase and decrease in population, and also to understand if there is or there isn't a balance between natural resources and population. So population history is also kind of an operative social science which tries also to create models, interpretative models, and have maybe an influence in policies. Population history, as of course we already said, has two main characteristics as a field of study. First one, population history is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, which is pretty much the same, and it means that population history, yes, it's a social science, but it's a social science which encompasses also a lot of elements from biology, from genetics, but as we said, also from linguistics and from political studies, from cultural studies, because also changes in mentality might have an impact on population, and of course also economic studies. And then it's global. This is kind of obvious because when we talk about population, we don't think about population in Venice or in Italy, but we think about population at a global level. So in many ways, population history, it's a specific field, it's a topic of a larger kind of history called global history. First of all, because of course, demographic phenomena have a global scale and a global context. They encompass all the world, not a single city, a single area, a single nation. But the other fact is that global history is mainly a methodology. It's mainly an analytical perspective. It's a new way of understanding history using mainly the idea of networks, exchanges, relations. And of course, exchanges and relations are very important in understanding population history because, for instance, one of the main and important demographic phenomena is migrations. And in order to understand migrations, we have to have in mind this global context and this idea of exchanges and relations. And then, of course, all the major facts which determine population changes along with migration, such as wars and epidemics, usually have a global impact, not only a local impact. For instance, this is very short and simple, but about migration during the early modern age. Early modern age, it's from, let's say, the discovery and conquest of America by Europeans until the 19th century. We have a series of streams of migration. We have 60 million Europeans who left Europe for the New World, but we also have, and this is less precise, there is a debate among historians, but we have a huge number, millions of people who left India for all over the world, not a precise and single nation. And then we have also another kind of migration in Asia, people who left Russia and Northern Asia to populate new areas, Siberia and Manchuria. And finally, we have a Chinese migration of 19 million people who left China and went to South Asia. And this is a peculiar kind of migration because mainly these people left China because they were merchants and they were looking for new chances and opportunities for their trade. So it's a bit different from the other migrations. And another important thing about global history and a global perspective is this one. Global does not mean a globe. It does not mean the totality. When we do global history, when we study population history in a global way, we are interested mainly in the connections, in the lines and dots, and not in the totality. It does not mean that I will explain to you how population is in every single village, but that I will explain phenomena which connected the world at a global level. And other important questions which are faced by historians regarding population are the following. First, how in different eras demographic growth is determined. And this, again, is the historical perspective. We are interested in explained population changes over time, over history. And then there is this other important question, how the balance between population growth and resources can be maintained. And as you can imagine, this is a less historical and more operative kind of question, because it should help also in the contemporary age to create models of sustainability. And about the balance. Well, is there a balance? This is much debated, of course. The general idea is that in a large, very, very large time span, the balance is present. If we look at population history in a very, very distant perspective over millennia, we might see that the growth of humanity has taken place in relative harmony with the growth of resources. So over the millennia, there is a sort of balance between human population and natural resources. However, in shorter chronological arcs, this balance is less evident. And in fact, in shorter chronological arcs, we don't have always an increase in population, but we have also many crises. We have a decrease in population because at some point it seems that we don't have a balance. It seems that there are no sufficient resources for the human population. So it's the answer is not fixed. It depends on the chronological arc. It depends on what are you looking for. If you have a historical perspective of if you are trying to maintain sustainability in a generation, in your present and modern time, for instance. In fact, it seems that sometimes there are a series of catastrophes which are sort of able to balance again population according to the resources. These catastrophes, of course, cause the decrease of population, and once again they are epidemics, but wars, but also climate change. Climate change is a very important issue nowadays, very debated, but it's not a novelty. We have had climate change also in the past. For instance, when we look at this painting, and this is a painting from the 17th century, it's a Dutch painting, it's kind of a romantic view. It's a city covered by snow. And this sort of winter landscapes were very common during the 17th century, but also the 18th and the 19th. And this was because we had a huge climate change during the early modern age, known as the Little Ice Age. This Little Ice Age, according to the estimates of historians and scientists, began in the second half of the 16th century. Then it reached its climax in the second half of the 17th century, and then it lasted until the end of the 19th century. And of course, this Little Ice Age has a romantic part, a positive maybe part. For instance, even the lagoon here in Venice freezed completely 5 times in this period. And there were like people skating in the lagoon. And this might be fun, but we also know that it had devastating effects on population in Europe. Entire villages, especially in the mountains, in the Alps, in Switzerland, were abandoned and destroyed because of the ice, and of course thousands of people died. They were weakened by the cold, they were not able to get enough energy sources, and we had also a huge deforestation in Europe in that time. So the climate change had a significant impact over especially European population. And since population is usually threatened by this series of things, epidemics, climate change, and wars, and especially it was threatened without any ability to repel these threats during the early modern age, until the early modern age, population during the early modern age meant also prosperity, stability, and safety. Because if a nation has a huge population, it means that it is a rich nation, because it means that this nation can sustain a huge population and also can have a huge labor force to further develop its economy. And of course, this progress in economy means also usually more political stability and more safety in general. So a huge population, and it's a bit different nowadays, was perceived during the early modern age as a very positive thing. And in fact, we have many descriptions, depictions of, you already know it, of cities and nations and countries filled with people. And if a city is crowded, is filled with people, it means it is a developed city. And this is a very classical example. Also, Levi Bacci uses it, and it's the example of Mexico City. And this is the description by one of the conquistadores, Bernal Diaz del Castillo. He was a soldier under the command of Cortés, the one who conquered the Aztec Empire. Mexico City was the capital city of the Aztec Empire. And when Bernal Diaz de Castillo describes Mexico City, one thing on which he is very insistent is that it's filled with so many people. And in general, the Aztec Empire is filled with great many cities filled with people. So it means that the Aztec Empire is a civilized empire. And in fact, it says we were astounded at the number of people. They arrived in this great marketplace. They were, of course, astounded at the number of, and the quantity and the quality of merchandises, but also at the number of people. And they say, once again, they had never beheld so large a marketplace and so full of people. And he even makes a comparison with other important cities of the time, Constantinople and Rome, to say that this Mexico City is so crowded, it's so full of people, and therefore it must be a wonderful place, filled with prosperity, stability, and safety, so it is worth to conquer it. And this is a topic which remains central for a very long period in European mentality. In fact, this passage is very completely different framework. It's like 300 years after, and the one writing it's a traveler. It's Goethe, the famous German writer and poet, and is traveling from Germany in order to visit Italy. And he reaches Veneto. Of course, I chose Veneto because we are in Veneto, but there are other many passages in this travel diary by Goethe. And this says that Veneto seems so rich and civilized to him because all the valleys are dotted with villages, castles, houses, so there are people. And all these many people are working people, hard-working people, so they were able to gain control over the environment, especially thanks to agriculture. And this says the road is filled with people of every class and occupation. So this topic of having a large population as a positive trait, it is very strong in European mentality and culture for all the early modern age. It is so strong that during the 17th century, a huge population is not only perceived as prosperity, stability, and safety, but it's perceived as a sign of political power. And so this is especially a British idea. Especially in Britain, we have this idea that true colonization could be achieved only through a massive migration, not only through armed conquest, but through migration. And migration is a double-faced topic because it can be positive, because migration could relieve the motherland of excessive population. And the authors, the intellectuals reflecting on this topic, they say that, of course, migration could relieve the motherland, especially of lower class people, and it can be good thing for the motherland, but it could also deplete the motherland, because if migration is excessive, the motherland can remain without population. And according to the British thinkers, it was what happened to Spain. Spain, of course, during the early modern age, had the most vast and more important empire. However, during the 17th century, Spain underwent a deep political and economic crisis. And according to the thinkers, especially in Britain, but also in the Netherlands and in France, one of the main reasons was that Spain and Spanish America did not have enough people, did not have enough population. And this thinker, Andrew Fletcher, even wrote a book about the problem of depopulation in Spain, the discourse concerning the affairs of Spain, published in 1698, and this said that the population is the only basis for great empires. So population, a huge population, is more important than, let's say, technological advancement, naval power, political stability. You can think to a lot of things. According to him, the most important basis is population. And so it's his idea, in order to help Spain or to avoid the fact that Britain had the same fate as Spain, was that the motherland must be always very attentive to repopulate both the colonies and itself. And this huge population then must be employed in productive activities, such as the cultivation of the land and the practice of commerce. So according to these thinkers, there is a strong link between commerce, agriculture, and a huge population. Huge population is necessary to practice agriculture as labor force, but also as a market to enlarge commerce. And this fear of the population and this idea of the importance of a huge population once again remained very important also during the Enlightenment. In fact, even in the encyclopedia, and maybe I think you know what the encyclopedia is. Do you know what the encyclopedia is? Okay, wonderful. The encyclopedia is, of course, the masterpiece of the French Enlightenment, and all over the encyclopedia we have a series of scattered reflections about population, and then we also have a proper entry about population. And in the encyclopedia, Denis Diderot, he reflects about population and the population, and once again, according to him, the population is one of the greatest dangers affecting America and Africa, and it's also one of the main reasons why Europe appears to be more advanced, while Africa and America are so backward in the 18th century, according to Diderot. And he is a bit different from Fletcher, because Fletcher had this colonizing idea. Instead, Diderot understood that, of course, the problems of America and Africa and the problems of the population are related to conquest and the subsequent state of slavery. And so it's, in some ways, a European's fault if America and Africa are so depopulated. But he concludes that only a huge population can help the prosperity and the civilization both of Africa and America. And during the Enlightenment, we also have another very important text, one of the first works entirely devoted to the study of population, by Mirabeau. And this Mirabeau is the father of the revolutionary leader. He was an economist, and reflecting upon economy and especially commerce and agriculture, he devised this idea that the most important and the most interesting of all objects of this world for humanity is, once again, population. And population is so useful that asking the question, is the population useful, yes or no, it seems at first glance that this question is the equivalent of this one: does the sun illuminate or not? So, once again, according to him, population is the main tool through which a nation can achieve prosperity in agriculture and commerce in a peaceful way, not through conquest. So, in this general framework, there is the idea over Europe during the early modern age that a densely populated land means a series of positive things. First of all, a stable social structure, and this stable social structure is related to a series of non-precarious human relationships, and this leads to well-exploited natural resources, and of course to the presence of a large labor force able to build infrastructures. So the general idea is that population and progress are strictly and strongly related, and population and progress work all together with agriculture and commerce, not with conquest. This is the Enlightenment idea about population as a positive force. In fact, if we look at population growth over millennia in a very, very large time span, it might seem that population is a signal of well-being because we have an increase in population. At the very beginning, we start, of course, all these numbers, especially the ones about prehistory, are estimates made on archaeological evidences, archaeological data, and so on. They are not certain. But the estimate is that at the very beginning we have 1 million inhabitants. Then, through the Neolithic Revolution, we achieved these 10 million people, and then until the Bronze Age, 100 millions. And at the end of the Industrial Revolution, so we are at the let's say at the end of the 19th century, we have 1 billion people, and then the estimate for 2050 is 10 billion people. Nowadays we are, as you know, 7 billion people. So it seems that while history and human history progresses, there is also a increase in population. However, human growth is not only demographic, so the growth in population, as we already partially said, is usually related to also a series of social, cultural, and political factors, and therefore to political, cultural, and etc. growth. And of course, there is another aspect. Demographic growth is not uniform over time. It does not go like this. It's more like this. And in fact, we have a series of cycles of expansion, stagnation, and reduction in population over time. Because there are all the social, cultural, economic, and political factors, but there are also biological and environmental conditioning in population increase and decrease. The first thing is mortality and reproductive laws, which regulate human population. And then there are a series of friction forces, which are not dependent on human beings. Reproductive strategies had been studied by biologists especially, and they concluded that we have two kinds of strategies. First strategy is called type R. Second strategy is called type K. Type R is the strategy of insects, fish, birds, small mammals, and so on. While the type K is the strategy of human beings and of a series of medium and big mammals, and also of some birds, such as, for instance, penguins. The air selection process is for living beings which live in very unstable environments and which benefits in favorable seasons, and then they reproduce with great rapidity. They have many offsprings, but there is a very low survival chance for all these offsprings. Think about insects. It's the most obvious case. Instead, the key selection, living beings and also human beings, live in a stable environment. However, this stable environment is not without dangers because it is populated by predators and parasites. So these living beings must compete in order to survive. This means that for each baby, for each puppy, for each children, the parents must make strong parental investments in time and energy. Therefore, each couple, each parent has a small number of puppies, children, because it is required much time and much effort to protect these children, puppies, in order to assure their survival. Usually key selection living beings have a large body size, a long lifespan, a long gestation, 9 months, and single births. For each birth, a single baby. Then, of course, we know there are exceptions, but they are exceptions. And a long interval between births, years after each each puppy. It's like, usually in human beings, 2-3 years at least, and then a long duration of generation. A human generation is 25-30 years, and therefore low potential growth rates. However, all these mechanisms, biological mechanisms of reproduction, are related with also the environment. So there is an important relationship between mortality, reproductivity, but also the environment when we think about population. And in population history, in population studies, the environment is the set of living conditions that determine survival. And then, of course, there is this close relationship between reproductivity and mortality. Because in general, the idea is that population equals birth minus death. So we have for each child, we have, if we don't have someone dying, there is an increase in population. But for pretty much all human history, birth rates and death rates are the same, pretty much. Not exactly the same, but pretty much the same. So the increase in population from the first century was significant, but not so enormous, because at the very beginning, we have, in the first century, we have 252 million people, and in 1750 we have 171 million people. So we have an average growth rate of only 1,000 inhabitants per year, which is not so huge. Because there are a lot of factors which can condition human population increase, especially in pre-industrial population until, let's say, mid-18th century. In fact, even if we have a relatively large number of births, and the estimate is like 5-8 children per woman, the chance of survival after birth are only between 20 and 40 years, not very much. And there is a strong subordination of human beings to the environment, and therefore a strong dependence of human beings to the natural resources. So there is a growth, but it's not so impressive. And about the estimates, about the numbers, when we talk about pre-industrial population, usually they are estimates. We have more certain numbers from this era, from this age. The first modern census was made in Spain in 1787, and it counted 10.4 million people. The other important census of the late early modern age was in the US in 1790, and it counted 3.9 million people. And the latest and most important census, contemporary census, was made in China in 2010, and it counted 1.340 billion people. Yes?
Are those numbers like in their own countries or in the whole world?
No, in their own countries, because they were censuses made by the government. So we might say that these data are exact, even though they are local. They are about only the single country. And the population, so usually it's correlated to birth and life expectations. And the world population varies. The increase and decrease in population can vary not only according to time, but also according to space. And the other very important thing from the pre-industrial age, for especially early modern age, is yes, population tripled, but it underwent a series of cycles of crisis and expansion. And in fact, population in Europe changed very much over the pre-industrial age. And we are talking about Europe because Europe is the most studied case, and Europe is the most studied case because we have more data about Europe. So it is easier to study Europe in order to understand these mechanisms of population because we have more data. And we know that already in the 6th century, population in Europe underwent a first crisis due to two of those factors, epidemics and wars, and it was the first outbreak of a plague epidemic and then the barbaric invasions which invaded the Roman Empire. Then there was a long cycle of expansion. Once again, this cycle of expansion was interrupted by another epidemic, the plague, the Black Death. And about the Black Death and about the consequences of the Black Death, we will talk more in detail tomorrow, because it really changed in many ways the course of history. And then we have another cycle of expansion after the recovery from the Black Death. And then for Europe, a stagnation begins, starting from the 18th century. And since population increase and decrease changes also in space, there is also this other aspect about population, and there is the change in demographic weight of each part of the globe. For instance, before the 16th century, population in Europe was the 14.5% of the world population. Then it increased, it was in fact the 18.1% of world population during the early modern age. Nowadays, it's only the 8.2. For America, it's the opposite. In the 18th century, America was only the 2% of the world population. Nowadays, it's the 13%. So it seems that in some ways there is a correlation between, in the long period of course, between demographic growth and the available resources. The available resources are a sort of limit for population growth, because in order to have, especially in the pre-industrial age. In order to have a population growth, we need to occupy new lands, we need new knowledge, we need advancements in technology. These are the only means through which, in some way, human beings can surpass, can overcome the natural limits. And these three factors, lands, knowledge, and technology, determined three demographic cycles in human history. The first cycle is from the origin to the Neolithic, then we have the Neolithic Revolution, and so we have from the Neolithic to the Industrial Revolution. And of course, with the Industrial Revolution, we have a huge change in the way human beings can control the environment, and so we have a new cycle from the Industrial Revolution to the contemporary age. And these advancements in technology and in knowledge, and also the expansion in space and in land, they meet with constraint forces. Constraint forces are very, very different, but they have two main characters. They are interdependent and they have a slow, very slow modifiability, and some of them are not modifiable at all. Constraint forces are in population studies, first of all, climate, then disease, land, and with land we mean especially land for agriculture. Then we have energy sources, food, overall space, not only land for cultivation, and settlements, patterns of settlements. And these constraint forces are interdependent, and here you have a few examples of interdependence between these constraint forces. For instance, the space, the total amount of space, influences settlements. Yes?
Can you go back just 2 slides to see the main character is interdependence and slow modification?
Yes.
Thank you, sorry.
Yes, interdependence and slow modifiability. And for some of these forces, they are not modifiable at all. So for instance, they are interdependent in the sense that space influences the patterns of human settlement. It influences the density of human settlements and the mobility, the way of communication and information between settlements. And of course, it influences also land availability. Land, on the other hand, produces food, raw materials, and energetic sources. So the more fertile is the land, the larger is the land, the more resources you can get. And of course, upon food and energy, we have better chances of human survival. On the other hand, also climate conditions land usability, and it conditions the kind of crops you can cultivate and the productivity, and it conditions also the kind of settlements and even pathology transmissions, disease transmissions. Pathologies, on the other hand, derive also from alimentation, and as you can imagine, pathologies influence both survival and reproductivity. So they have an impact both on mortality rates and birth rates. And space and settlement, especially the density of settlement, are related to disease transmission, as we will see in a few moments in an historical perspective. Then there are some forces which are non-modifiable. It does not mean that they not change over time. It means that it is impossible for human beings to willingly modify these forces according to their own desire. However, other sort of forces like land, energy, food, and pathology and settlements can be changed over a long period and through advancements in technology. Advancement in agricultural technology and the occupation of new lands, but new lands are not like infinite, can increase food and energetic sources, and this was the main goal in at least two of those migrations, migration and the conquest of Europeans from Europe to America, and also the migration from Russia to Siberia and from China to Central Asia. They were the attempt to gain new lands and to establish a more productive agriculture. But new land is not infinite. So there are also advancements in technology, and especially in textiles and in buildings, which can reduce the impact of climate and better the chance of human survival. And then it's rather intuitive advancements in medicine, which can defend from pathologies and from the spreading of pathologies. And in a very, very long period, human can adapt and can create immunity, but only to certain pathologies. And for instance, it's the case with smallpox. European people were not immune, but they were more prepared, let's say. So in many cases, smallpox for European did not mean death. Instead, for Native Americans, it meant death, because they were not immunized. They did not have the proper antibodies, because they had not been exposed to such pathologies before. And then there is also a factor of human choice in human increase and decrease. It's not only about constraint forces, it's also about, as I said, culture and mentality, especially. When I talk about choice, it's not that it is always the choice of the single person, all these actions, but it means that these actions, they are not dependent on the nature and on the environment, but more on human being and on cultural conditions. So the age of marriage and the number of married couples, and as a consequence the number of children, it's an important factor. Because it has been studied, for instance, the case of French Canada, and we will talk about it more in detail tomorrow, but the incredible increase in European population in French Canada was also due to the fact that in French Canada people married at a very young age, so they started to have children at a very young age, and so they had more children. And then there is, of course, the fact of birth control, because we have abortion, but we have also another series of factors which were used to control birth, to have less children, because in many cultures, especially nomadic cultures, non-agricultural cultures, children were a burden. So we have a series of sexual taboos. We have a very, very long duration of breastfeeding. Breastfeeding in prehistory and also in nomadic societies can last until, let's see, 4 or 5 years. So a child of 4 or 5 years is still breastfed. It means until you breastfeed a children, you cannot have another one. So it means that you have less children. And then migration. Migration is sometimes choice, sometimes it's forced, but it depends on human condition, not on environmental conditions. And these, once again, are the main streams of migration in history, especially the early modern age. We have this huge stream of migration from Europe and Africa to America, with a huge difference, because the migration from Europe was a willing migration, while the migration from Africa to America was a forced migration. It was the slave trade. which moved like 10 million people from Africa to America, and then from Russia to Siberia, and as we said, from China to Central Asia. But in general, when we talk about all these mechanisms, when we talk about the balance, a possible balance, we must always remember that even though we have a series of constraint forces, we have these sort of choices, population does not have any natural providential regulatory mechanism which keeps in balance demographic growth and resources. So there isn't an invisible hand, there isn't a providence which keeps in balance, always in balance, human population and resources. And therefore, we have cycles of expansion and cycles of crisis, because we don't have this balance as something natural in our human condition. And in fact, for instance, if we look at the population growth more closely in an historical perspective, we might see that at the beginning, during the Neolithic, we have this sort of Neolithic revolution. The Neolithic revolution means that human beings gain control over food production. And this revolution was gradual and especially uneven. So it was not something which affected the whole world at the same time. It started in the Near East, in China and in Mesoamerica, and then there was a transition from Asia to Europe. And along this huge change in human mentality and human societies, of course, there is also demographic growth, and there is also higher population density. And the main change is that we pass from hunters to farmers, from nomadic societies to sedentary societies. And in fact, the three pillars of the Neolithic revolution are agriculture, domestication, and sedentary society. Agriculture, of course, is the production of food, and domestication is the domestication of big mammals and of some birds in order to have beasts of burden and food. And the sedentary society is the creation of permanent human settlements for the first time in history, because before that all the human societies were nomadic. And it started, as I said, especially in Near East, and then it caused massive migration from the Near East to Europe, and these migrants brought agricultural knowledge to Europe. And the model of this migration was explained by Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza with this very simple model. This agricultural development caused a population growth. This population growth caused the necessity of new lands, and it caused a short-range migration of only 1 kilometer per year. Kilometer by kilometer, people from the Near East arrived in Europe. This model is based on a series of archaeological data, especially in cemeteries about dead people, and why they migrated in such a short range. And this was because the first form of human agriculture was what we call the slash and burn agriculture. Slash and burn agriculture works in a very simple way. There is a forest, there is something wild, and I want to cultivate it, so I burn it. After having burned it, the soil is more fertile. So I cultivate my crops, I collect my crops, and then I move to another part of the forest, and then I burn it, and once again, from the Near East, I arrive in Europe. And this is the model. It's a model widely acknowledged and accepted by the scientific community. And so, at the beginning of this first cycle with the Neolithic Revolution, we passed from 1 million people to 6 million inhabitants. And at the end, before the early modern age, I have 250 million people. And the growth is very similar to the overall growth, because once again it's 1,000 inhabitants per year. So until the Industrial Revolution, the patterns of growth of human population remained the same from the Neolithic to the 18th century. And why and how did this growth happen with the Neolithic Revolution? We have a classical theory by this scholar, Gordon Childe. According to Gordon Childe, agriculture and domestication permit a more regular food supplying. Therefore, health and survival are bettered, mortality decreases, mortality, not reproductivity, and so population growth increases. This is the classical theory. But we have also new perspectives and new studies, and these new studies devised a very, very different model according to which we have an increase both in mortality and in reproductivity. Of course, the increase in reproductivity is higher, and therefore we have an increase in overall population. Why mortality increase is higher in this new and more civilized kind of society? Well, first of all, nutrition levels, quality and quantity of the food are worsened by agriculture-based supply. This means that with agriculture, the majority of people don't have any access anymore to proteins, especially to meat. So their nutrition levels are worsened. Then sedentary societies, permanent settlements, higher density of population encourage the diffusion of infective disease. And also domesticated animals transmit parasites and their own diseases to human beings, and even agricultural developments such as irrigation favor the diffusion of malaria. So we have a mortality increase because of worse food and because of massive disease transmission. However, we have also a reproductivity increase, and this reproductivity increase is not only a biological thing, but mainly a social change due to sedentary societies. Thanks to sedentary societies, we have shorter interval between births, so we have many children for each couple, for each woman. In fact, a sedentary society means that it is easier to provide for the children, to safeguard them. And it also means that children are not perceived anymore as burdens, but as useful. They are perceived as free labor force by their parents, because in agriculture we need a massive labor force, and the less expensive it is, the better it is. So we have the starting of large families with many children. And so we have these differences in reproductivity rates between nomadic hunters, it's 5.7 children, it's an average of course, and the reproductivity in sedentary farmers is 6.3 children. And so by these half children per year, we have this increase in reproductivity rates, which counterbalances the increase in mortality rate, and overall we have an increase, a slow increase in population. And so this is the model which explains in the more comprehensive way why during the Neolithic we have this growth in population. And this model continued until the Great crisis of the 14th century. In the 14th century, in fact, we have this crisis due to a very devastating epidemic, a series of epidemics, and therefore we don't have anymore this balance between mortality and reproductivity. And so people, especially in Europe, had to devise new strategies to defend themselves and then to have once again population growth. But we will see all this new phase, this crisis, and then the solutions devised in Europe and then also at a global level next lesson, that is to say tomorrow.